Hi, good morning. My name is Dr. Gareth Edel, and I'm here to talk today about sex, gender, sexuality, homophobia, sexism, and structural issues related to all that. And we're going to try and do it in a comprehensive way, drawing from multiple theories in contemporary sociology.
Okay, so today's lecture is about the ideas of gender, sex, sexuality, and in particular, looking at those configurations or categories or systems as elements within the sociological understanding of how identity and social roles works. And we've talked through discussion of the mechanisms of social action, especially the two very broad categories of socialization in which one learns and is instructed in social interactions, in schools, in the objects and artifacts around us, in the very way that we are able to meet our needs and respond to other people. We're taught how to be the kind of people we are, and we're taught how not to be. And then we talked about deviance and the fact that those categories, those roles, those systems, those expectations and norms, they are enforced. And part of what we're doing when we enact or respond to our own socialization is to enforce it on other people. Now, that was a very different thing in a much simpler and much more homogeneous society system where local cultures were often strictly divided by geography and distance, by language breaks, by cultural institutions and social forms that meant if you thought about gender one way in one place and somebody thought about it a different way in another place, that those were unlikely to interact. The fact that there were historically groups that had very different ideas did not cause conflict until those groups interacted, and especially until one of those groups gained a social relation that produced a power where they were able to attempt to produce the other group's ideas as deviant or to enforce their own. Now, last week we were talking about race and ethnicity, and in the same way that we distinguish between a much more absolute or essentialized system of identification with race and a more flexible, no less to some degree real, but socially determined set of categories that we have to modify and understand in terms of ethnicity. We were speaking in that time about how people were based in their discussion or their social construction of how people are divided on things like skin color, like national origin, or tribal identifications. And that when we see the response to those separations or categorizations, the taxonomies, the rules of what kinds of people are possible, produce a lot of really serious consequences or side effects, or in many cases, those effects are the function of the category. It's produced in order, sometimes harmlessly, sometimes with tremendous harm, as a way to distinguish between people. And it's not that it is fundamentally biological or natural, and it is changeable over time, but it is a real part of our social construction at any given moment that we have these mechanisms to do it. And we ended up last week talking about intersectionality, the idea that these different complex systems of identification, categorization, social production, and shaping of individuals and groups, the different kinds of categories affect each other. They make it different in effect. And so those societal structures, the legal, the political mechanisms that respond to them, the physical architecture, the infrastructure and technologies that rely on those categories in how they are functioning are complicated. In general, we're going to recognize that last week there were very similar systems of social formations or social institutions that formed the social institution, the macro or the gigantic social institution that is race. And this week, we're going to recognize that whether you want to talk about it as the social institution of sex or gender, but that social institution that we're talking about this week, while it's highly variable around the world, it does have a set of patterns at the moment. And so while last week we might have been looking at appearance or morphology, that is the shape of bodies, the way faces are shaped or how hair is shaped, that may have been part of what we were looking at last week. It may be part of what we look at this week. Ancestry, religion or cultural group, national identity. Last week we talked about identification, and especially there is an important difference in how we're going to talk about gender versus race, in that last week most of the social functions, the roles, the relations and systems we talked about were about how other people performed the act of identification. And we're not going to say that there is no performative aspect, there is no self-identification in race, but that the power and the techniques by which identification happens in race tend to allow less flexibility than other ways of identifying or ways of performing. And the policing of it recognizes in deviancy that there would be less flexibility. So if you were to change your race, that is a very different thing from a system like, to some degree, a more minor form of modification of masculinity or femininity within the spectrum of things we talk about in race and gender. Choosing to have long hair does not immediately present a problem in some ways. Choosing to have short hair does not immediately get policed the same way that changing your skin color or using systems of identification would be problematic in systems of race. And that's not a natural thing. That's about the construction of the formation and the institution. It's about how those roles and the naturalization or essentialization that say this is absolute happen. And we also saw that ethnicity was a little more flexible, although in the reading we did see that within white ethnic identities, in fact, even to some degree, white racial identities, because they were more flexibly determined, participated in, there were differences there also. And so one of the things that we're going to see is that in the spectrum of things we're talking about today, when we talk about race, as last week, and we talk about sex and gender and sexuality, well, this time what we're talking about are things that are probably not necessarily, not naturally linked, right? There is no fundamental or essentialist argument that says we should be identifying what makes you sexually attracted or aroused, how activities in the biological process or reproduction and child rearing should be, right? We can make all the arguments we want that there are evolutionary or biological arguments, but the reality is that those two processes don't have to be linked except for historical social production, right? We don't have to think about physical responses in the body to certain stimuli as only being connected to reproduction. And similarly, we have huge numbers of moral and social aspects that we ascribe to who and how people should live, who they are, what kind of job, what kind of stuff, that are encoded or linked to ideas that are then also connected to this spectrum of stuff that is mixed and muddled, this overlapping Venn diagram in which sexuality or sexual interests, sexual activities and behaviors, reproductive biology, reproductive interests, reproductive practices and behaviors, colors, attributes, sense of perfume, appropriate forms of clothing, etc. All of these things could in another process have been left separate. But one of the things that's particularly important to recognize about a difference is that the social production and the social formation of sex, gender, and sexuality have responded to a whole lot of stuff going on in the last 100 years to be slightly more focused on self-identification and performance for people, especially in the United States, especially in Europe, especially in some places, that allows us to talk about self-identification in a different way. And we're not going to answer that difference today. We will talk about what that difference is and how the social institutions are coming about, but we're also going to recognize that there's going to be a leftover question. Why can we talk about sex and sexuality, gender in a different way? So that's what we're talking about this week. I mentioned comparing gender, sex, sexuality, etc., to aspects of race and ethnicity, that we would be talking about essentialization. And I want to go back to something I said in the last slide, that there are people who socioculturally disagree with it, that there is no natural biological sex. And the reality is that over time, science has largely demonstrated that the forms of differentiation that we link to sex are not. And clearly, the evidence is that they are not as simple as a two-party or a two-person or a two-category gender binary. And that is, science has said that, for example, between intersex and biological variations, about 1 in 10 people are strictly neither gender if we use the hard line categories of those feminine and masculine qualities that had been associated with biological sex. Now, to be more specific, that means that about 1 in 10 people is not one sex or the other. And we could argue that that produces a spectrum where people tend to be towards one end or the other. We could talk about the need to produce a third sex category. That's the response that science has traditionally done in the 20th century to produce categories, whether you were going to talk about intersex, which is the current medical category for people who are in that 1 in 10, where they have a chromosomal or a hormonal or a morphological difference recognizable to science to be outside of the binary. And whether you're talking about the sort of simplistic genetic explanation of sex that people often get in their high school biology, XX versus XY, an XX chromosome produces a biological development that is in the grown organism that is female, while the XY, because of the limiting action, because everybody is basically female until a Y chromosome says don't do some of the women's stuff. And a Y chromosome doesn't do much besides that. It's a signaling device to say that the cell biology should produce a different effect. Except there are actually 100 other genetic factors that participate and produce variability in how much of a certain hormone, testosterone, you have, or whether you might have, for example, as is the example that starts the chapter in the textbook, you might have androgen insensitivity. So you have, in fact, a whole bunch of the genetic things, including a Y chromosome, that we might say should produce a female body, but that because of other genetic factors, the ability for the Y chromosome to direct development into a male body is prevented. And that's just one example. It turns out that there are quite a few of these, and about 2/3 of intersex or non-binary biological sex would be invisible. So, for instance, there are a significant number of women who are just less fertile. They will have no ability to bear children, non-functional ovaries or something like that, because they have a difference in biology that would not be visible except as the phenotype of decreased fertility. And if the question of how we think of biology is simplified, if we really do say it's essentially you turn on a switch and the baby is born as a woman, then that means that all of those mechanisms biologically should be functioning that way. Similarly, there are women who have without a gross anatomy change or something like that. They have a higher level of androgens. Their body will develop in slightly more masculine traits, muscle development or hair development, etc. And the same thing is true for men. There are men who we wouldn't say they aren't men as a colloquial thing, but biologically they have been produced with an internal ovary rather than a testy. That is, they are partially biologically female according to scientific definitions if they're simplified. Or you have somebody who has a higher production of estrogen, which can produce a high voice, but very little else. There are a million ways that developmental biology shows that those simple binary categories of male or female are more complicated. And so in sociology, drawing from that discussion of the biological properties, we will still recognize that there are a social constructed category of biological gender, but we're actually going to say that that is not to be essentialized. It's not to be naturalized as if it isn't questionable. So while the majority of human beings don't necessarily fall outside those categories, we can't assume that the categories are absolute and natural when about 1 in 10 people doesn't fall into it. And the same thing will be true when we move into discussion of sexuality. The process of socialization, the process of production of people as either heterosexual, that is, interested in the other sex, the other gender in terms of your interest for romantic, sexual, or reproductive actions, or homosexual, that is, you are interested to some degree in somebody of the same sex or gender for your sexual or romantic attractions. The linking of those things is complicated, and it will also be shown in almost all scientific research not to be simplistically binary. And we'll talk more about that as we move on. But the point here is that one of the reasons to have two separate languages, one of sex and one of gender, comes out of an effort to try and get people to question sex and the gender binary of male and female, particularly because questioning that as a biological natural thing was so difficult for people. And so introducing a different language to talk about those other aspects, the stuff that is recognizably social, how we cut our hair, how we stand, how you use your hands in conversation, how a norm is enforced, whether you're allowed to yell, whether you're doing something, the premise of discussion of gender, because in fact, linguistically, gender and sex made the same thing until we started doing this work of denaturalizing sex. And so scientists, particularly in medical and biological sciences, started trying to use the language of gender and the language of sex separately to try and reduce the number of questionable cases, right? So if within just pure biological sex, it's 1 in 10, once you start including things like the expression or performance of femininity, the expression or performance of masculinity, the conceptual flavor of the week for whatever we're talking about as a trait or behavior for men or women, well, the scientists didn't like that. So they wanted to be able to separate that other stuff out where the claim of biological was already weaker. And in response, a lot of scholars in feminist theory, a lot of scholars in social sciences in general, such as sociology, work within this split, that there are things that we no longer have to argue the biological essentialism about. There's no biological determinism about wearing pink or blue, despite what a lot of fighting in the United States about gender reveal parties and about the necessary to police, for example, what toys are sold at Target. The nature of those things cannot be argued to be biological. And so sometimes that essentialization, that naturalization is about religious or other cultural beliefs. But from a scientific point of view, if we can't claim it as a scientific belief, it does not gather legitimacy from that system. Now, the argument here is that what's the point of doing this? Or we have and do live in a complex system of gender that has tremendous effects. And the philosopher Ian Hacking criticized a lot of work in the social sciences from social construction by saying, if we ask why it is socially constructed without going the next step of saying we must make a determination about whether the current configuration is correct, how we will respond to social construction. And it's actually a much more open question how we respond to this in terms of gender. The politics are very much up in the air and they're being fought over. The rights of women, the ability or access to healthcare, the kinds of stuff we talk about in discussion of gender confirming medicine. There's a lot more response to and use of the discussion of social construction around gender than there is much of the time for race. And so when I said before that the system, the social construction that is the social formation of race is still a little more essentialized, is still a little more firm, um, that's part of what I'm talking about. So the the contingency claim, that is, that the way race is or the way that sex and gender are now is mostly just dependent on our belief and our support of them, right? The quote from Hacking in the picture there is the instantiation and distribution of gender roles. That is the way that they are now, how they actually exist, what is there. That's the instantiation, and they're contingent, they're dependent on social events and arrangements. That's the contingency claim. And for Hacking and for a lot of other philosophers and scholars on the issue of social construction, the whole point of that is that that allows you to question and enact alternatives, right? The instantiation being made up doesn't make that easy, right? As sociologists, we want to recognize that changing that encoding, that socialization, that belief that forms the core of and aspects of the institution, just because it is contingent, just because it's not permanent, it can and has changed. That's not enough. You have to then talk about which parts of that are, for example, causing inequality that produces harm, right? The current instantiations and distributions of gender roles are hurting people. 79 cents on the dollar for women is not equitable, right? The fact that in many healthcare insurance plans in the United States, the ability to get a kind of medicine is easier for men or for women may be producing issues. So for instance, it is more common for men to be offered painkillers than it is for women because there is a sexist belief that women are more able to respond to pain and manage it themselves without good painkillers. Well, in some cases, there are probably even measurable scientific differences in pain threshold, but the idea that some minor biological difference justifies the regime or the system by which we give painkillers is ridiculous. And you can talk about the same thing. Why do we want to talk about de-essentializing race? Because whatever you might or might not, and in this case you absolutely cannot show biological differences in pain experienced by black children and white children, doctors are worried about the social production of addiction and in some cases they're actually trying to respond to real issues where it is worse, you will be punished and more likely to go to jail as an addict if you're black than if you're an addict if you're white. So they are overall dramatically less likely to give black children and teens painkillers than they are a white child or teen, even if you're having extreme pain due to a surgery or something like that. And so we get this question of, if we de-essentialize, if we open up these discussions, can we recognize and then respond to the bad parts? And the hope is yes, right? And that therefore we need a reformation claim. It would be possible by opening this up, by looking at gender and moving away from the dualism or the gender binary, we can in fact recognize and give better protections, more personhood, more individual freedom to people to be who they are, and we can repair a lot of those negative aspects. So the reason we're talking about social construction, the reason to recognize the difference and to shrink the category of biological sex, if you're going to keep it, is because it allows us the capacity to repair these harms. So in the last slide, we were talking about the premise of anti-essentialism. That is, the reason to do social construction analysis is to be able to do this. And I want to be able to distinguish a little bit more specifically about the difference between sex and gender. In general, we've already had a lot of work over the 20th century which has moved gender, that is all of the social stuff that is not directly linked to biology in the popular conception. We've moved gender away from being a binary a little bit more. Now, a binary is a paired set, and one of the reasons that we're going to still talk about gender as a binary is because as a paired set, male and female, masculine, feminine, gender is still governed. It is still regulated within the social world by a pair of non-overlapping things, A or B. And whereas sex is generally still the two circles of the Venn diagram are not touching, there's been a lot of movement in the last really 60 years to push back against the binary of gender. Right? It's okay for men to wear pink. It's okay for women to have short hair. There is a lot of the social stuff that there has been a lot of work to decrease the binary and allow overlap in that Venn diagram. But we also want to be aware that most binaries include a form of stratification or hierarchy. And the language coming out of, literary analysis and stuff like that is to look at whether the binary forms a dichotomy. That is a division where the two circles cannot be overlapping. And this is one of the reasons why it's worth distinguishing here between sex and gender, because we can recognize that a woman can have short hair. That is, that there can be an overlap in the binary of gender without giving up on an absolute belief in the non-overlapping of that Venn diagram of sex. Now, I would argue, scientifically speaking, there is no dichotomy in either one. There is going to be overlap in either case. But if we're socialized to believe that the two categories are defining each other, as part of that they cannot overlap, then what we're looking at is what is called a dualism, right? That we don't actually need to define one of the categories in every way, right? If we know that women are gentle, we know men are hard. If we know that men are serious and logical, then we know that women, by contrast, tend to be or are non-serious. They're emotional, not logical. And what we look for is systems by which the binary categories are encoded as dualisms. And this is a particularly important place to work on trying to change our ideas, or that concept in the last one that we're going to try and correct or fix what are harmful problems of the social construction. And while the most famous example of the dualism in general is Descartes' mind-body dualism, where he says, look, it can either be mind or it can be body. And you can't do both. Like, your mind isn't your body. Your mind is not, it's not part of your body. It is something above and more true and more important. Well, maybe, right? We're able to see them as different and non-overlapping things, I guess, because we've been taught to. But in fact, it turns out, scientifically speaking, almost all, if not all, dualisms are going to be wrong, right? The effects of our brain on our mind are clear. The effects of our stomach, well, try and imagine you're hangry, you're hungry and therefore angry. And it turns out that, among other things, your stomach is deeply connected to the serotonin production and processing that produces brain effects. right? So that butterfly in your stomach feeling that people talk about, that's literal. When you're nervous, your body is producing hormones both in the brain, in your thyroid, in your stomach, and those hormones and signaling factor chemicals are literally connected in your stomach and in your brain. And this idea that we can productively just talk about the brain without talking about the body then becomes mostly about what question you're asking. And the same thing is true for how we talk about sex and gender, right? Sometimes culturally, the hard dualism, the fact that we are taught, even if it's not true at an abstract level or a biological level or a natural level, but the fact that we're taught to see these as absolute different things, it produces real effects in the real world. And in the easiest way to think about that problem is that for people who aren't one or the other, for people who are hybrid or mixed or don't fall, then if your binary is hardened, if it's become a dichotomy, if it's real dualism, if how we've got a social construction of meaning says that there should not be any overlap, then all of a sudden you've produced a category of people who are in that overlap and either have to be stigmatized and harmed, or you have people who must hide how they actually would be. And in the chapter, this is where we get this real issue of in a binary, there, if you add a third category, for instance, in medical science, we have male, female, and then intersex. Well, and the same thing is true with gender. We have binary gender of masculine and feminine, and we have transgender. And so as a result, we begin to recognize more categories, but the way that third category, non-cisgender, non-masculine or feminine, not male or female, whatever, however categorically you want to look at that, if we're still enforcing the binary, then you are producing that third category as deviant. You are making them to some degree wrong. And so we're going to move from this discussion of the binary aspect of sex and gender to a discussion of the performativity, the systems of gender identity. And then we'll come back to some of the other questions. Okay, so just to make absolutely clear, between 2 and 3% of human beings do not match the traditionally considered biological binary of sex. And there are a million reasons to consider and decide who is in what category in any category. There's nothing absolute about this. So for the record, there is no such thing as biological sex in the same way that there is no such thing as biological race beyond there is something very meaningful and in use in this category. And the fact that we think about things in certain ways, for example, that we use the general ability to have reproduction of a next generation to define these things, tells us about structures and values in our society. But at a fundamental level, whether you are endosex, that is normative, or whether you're intersex, that is not so normative, we will generally still be talking about the vast majority of what makes you a person, what makes you human, what makes you mostly male, mostly female in the same ways. And as we start overlapping into issues of gender, that is the performance, the actions, the expectations, the professional, the social, the educational, then these biological aspects become a tiny, tiny component of what we're talking about in gender. And I know that this is a category that many people have been taught to think of as absolute and fundamental. But what we get by looking at the history of these things, at the science of these things, whether you're talking about the genetics, whether you're talking about the process or conception of linking reproduction with sexual pleasure, of the differentiation and the, for example, labeling of certain hormones as masculine or male hormones and female hormones, it's just ridiculous. Like the The reality is that all the hormones used to define womanliness in a biological sense exist within male bodies to different degrees. All the androgens, literally named those things of men, right? All the androgens and all the hormones that are considered to define the male biological body are found in women in slightly different variations. And literally throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout life cycle, depending on behavior and diet, men and women have vastly different levels of those hormones, right? There are almost 100 different genetic conditions that change and adjust how sexuality and sex and bodily shape and ability to reproduce happen that are wildly common. So while doctors would recognize that about 2 in 100 people, as a clean argument, right? On this very slide, I've chosen to include the 2%, the 1.5%, 1.7%, right? Depending on which things you include in that list of things, that can be above 3%, right? Things that don't have a big effect, for example, on the ability to have children, tend not to appear in the intersex category. So, for instance, hypertrichosis, the having too much hair, whether it's a man or a woman, is hypertrichosis, right? That doesn't affect your ability to have kids. It's not intersex, but we would recognize that a woman with a beard is not gender normative in the sense of her biological structure. And similarly, a man who has a micropenis, a man who has a characteristic that is regarded as making him less manly from the body, but could still produce offspring in the expected way, tends not to be in this category of intersex also. And my point isn't to say that the body doesn't matter. Bodies matter a lot, but they are not clearly defined in a binary category. And so all sorts of secondary or tertiary characteristics can in some cases be counted as gendered, but not in others. And as long as there is that flexibility, as long as we can find within those available to be considered or ignored different aspects, well, then we're not talking about a biological category, we're talking about the process by which a category is determined to be important. So, biological sex is still one of the social categories that we're talking about, but even with that, we do need to be clear, mostly what we're talking about is a system by which certain categories are protected by labeling them natural or essential. In a little while in the lecture, I'll talk more about the idea of feminism, the process, and the production of both the systems of meaning that define what feminism is, but also why it happens in Western societies. And before we get there, I just wanted to talk for a minute about one of the famous early 20th century books from feminism is The Second Sex, is Simone de Beauvoir's book that says the battle of sexes is not implicit in the anatomy of man and woman. One is not born a woman, but becomes one. And that's the most famous quote, this idea that while you have a biological aspect to who you are, it is the social production, the socialization and in training that really puts you into the category. And part of that becomes extraordinarily obvious if you think about it, because to some degree, children have the same biology as adults, right? You're not supposed to think about children as being sexual, and that's good. We don't want children to be abused. But you literally have to pause for a second and recognize that there is that layer of in training and production that makes you become something different as you grow up. And part of that is going to be about how the actual brain develops. But for instance, in modern conception, we recognize that the brain is still not fully developed, right? We are not effectively over the hump and on the way down it's set or degrading until you're around 25 years old. So we're not going to say that the human being just isn't a full human being until they're 25. We're not going to say that until they're 18. Depending on where you are, that set of questions, when can we expect the training or the production of an adult man or woman to be done? That's the question. And when we read about socialization, we read about a variety of different theories to talk about socialization, about how it's done, about in which ways socialization is most fundamental. And I really do want us to think about gender particularly, but even sex in that way, right? If you are maybe potentially more likely to be a woman because of biology, or potentially more likely to be a male because of biology, but then there are all these other things that get involved, all this labeling, marking, production of deviancy, marking, suggesting of success, expectations about what behaviors to do. This goes back to de Beauvoir's argument that one is not made a man or a woman overnight, and one is not born a man or a woman. You become that through this process of a life in a society. And classification of identity, or how those various kinds of identity are bound to their social place, is really important, right? So the idea that we can reclaim non-binary genders, to recognize that, for instance, there were within Native and Indigenous groups in the United States, there were up to 3 or 4 different genders recognized. There were one name for some of those tribes, although it wouldn't have been in English, would have been Two-Spirit, right? And we can recognize that those variations and processes can't be socialized in the same way now, but that it may be truer to our reality, truer to our expectations and ability to live meaningful lives in our society if somebody is allowed to be Two-Spirit, right? And at the same time, the same question or discussion about how much we should force people to expect to be sexual, right? Are we allowed to be agender? Are we allowed to be asexual? Or is one allowed to be aromantic, that is without romantic feeling? And to what degree that is a product of biological nature is not important if what we recognize is the process of socialization that gives things names, that gives things the ability to be thought. And in particular, where we move into the process by which socialization is done through the enforcement or the punishment of the deviant. If we're going to recognize that a significant amount of what we're doing, of how we're doing it, is telling other people how to live, then one of the aspects of socialization that we want to pay attention to is the way in which individual choices and structures and politics and institutions and technologies and architecture and things are telling us who we can be. And I think one of the great or most important things that we get from the study of identity, of possibility, and of social construction in sociology is that it allows us to be mindful that that process of giving options, of how we teach in our daily lives, how we show or adjust, how we threaten other people or don't, that is a process that can be understood so that we may have some control over how we are building the world that we live in. I recently watched a Republican senator from, I want to say Tennessee, on TV say that the possibility that there were trans people in sports was a fundamental problem. And initially, I didn't know what he meant by that, but he talked about the fact that often people just assume this is about an unfair advantage. And this senator, he paused and he actually said something which was both profoundly disturbing and against what people are often saying, right? Because often the discussion of issues like trans students or trans athletes is that there is something unfair about it. And I've always had a problem with that because I think if we wanted to produce fair contests in sports, we would do things the way that they do it in boxing, for example, where in some forms of boxing you actually do get men and women, but the decisions are based on body size, right? How tall you are, how heavy you are. And in competitive professional boxing, boxing is done separated by gender, but the reality is that the reason you wouldn't want a 300-pound muscled super heavyweight fighting a flyweight guy at 100 pounds is obvious. But how a slight statistical variation in pelvis or how a slight statistical variation in facial hair, how other sexual characteristics of biology, if we were going biology, affected a bias in terms of the ability to perform a sports task had always confused me. And this guy on TV, this senator said it has nothing to do with that. That was a misdirection, right? That it didn't have to do with the fact that they were talking about a recent case where an athlete who had performed well, they'd done well in their competitions, they'd been seen as having been benefited from being trans. And he said the problem isn't if they'd lost every race, it would have been just a problem, just as much of a problem. And that struck me. I couldn't understand it because I'm like, I could understand making an argument. I mean, I wouldn't agree with it, but I could understand making that argument that you can't have like a 7-foot basketball player and a 5-foot basketball player playing against each other. I mean, except actually in the NBA, you have had teams with, a 7-foot player up against a 5'8" player, and you do get a real game of it because to be a professional athlete, everybody has gone through so much training and socializing to be an exceptional athlete. It doesn't really matter the biological starting point within a certain range of effect. Right? You're never going to have a power forward in the NBA who's 5'9", but you can have a really good passing and shooting player who's 5'9", and it's happened before. But this senator, he said, the issue isn't that. The issue is that we need things like sports to stay pure. And I want you to understand that much of the time, people don't come out and say these honest things like that, right? So this senator said, it doesn't matter. I'm not worried about the children. I'm not protecting somebody. We need institutions like sports to keep those categories protected or pure. And the fact that he would say that on TV was amazing to me because I don't think he's sociologically informed. I don't think he's aware of what he's saying. Right? He's not coming out with a description of the social production of stuff. He's not talking about institutions. He is literally just afraid that without those institutions and structures reinforcing it, people will be more willing, more able to recognize a different way of understanding things. And what we're looking at whenever we look at categories is the category itself and what's excluded, right? You need a border around the United States to say this is the United States, but you also need that border to say that's not the United States. And whenever we talk about categories, we're talking about the things that fall within them or outside of them. And so whenever we're looking at any of these aspects of behavior, of identification, we can try and recognize which forms of category, right? The parts that are biologically coded or more deeply connected to there being a biological difference, those are sex. And so we will produce the categories, both the deviant and the expected, in terms of that. But those don't always work exactly the same way as other categories and other institutions. So the idea of gender, that is the policing, the production, the participation of these systems of masculinity, femininity, and identity that are linked to sex but are recognizably distinct from them, Those are different things. And the fact that not everybody can fall neatly into a category produces other categories. Throughout my lifetime, this has been very obvious because I happen to have been aware of and able to see the growth of languages to talk about this, which generationally is a little harder for you guys because, for instance, you did not see, starting in the 90s, the development of the language of non-binary. You didn't get that process being attacked in the same way that whether you're talking about transgender or transsexual or other languages to talk about those variations from expectation. And again, we're going to distinguish between what is normal, that is what is present or common, and that which is expected and enforced, that which is normative. So all of the stuff we're talking about today, if we actually look at the frequency, statistically, the frequency of an event happening, of a kind of person, they are much more diverse than we would recognize. So the number of trans people, up to 3 out of 100 people in the United States already identify as being within this umbrella of trans identities, that is strongly non-binary or transgender. Right, that's 3 in 100 in the United States, and there are other countries that have slightly higher, slightly lower, and there's a lot of freaking out by conservatives who pretend that that's all new, and it's not, right? Like, I remember being introduced when I was 10 years old, mid 80s, to one of my parents' students who was no longer Danny, now they were Dee Dee, and for example, at the time, the language of dead naming didn't even exist, so when I said, no, I don't remember Dee Dee, there was no way, there was no social structure, there was no name convention to say, don't remind them that that's the same person Danny was by using the name Danny. It didn't exist. And those processes by which we produce, destigmatize, deviate, or define as deviant, all of those categorical elements becomes complicated. And the history of those social connections, for example, the production of a universal system of binary and dichotomous, where male and female are considered never to have the same characteristics, those historical processes have to do with a history of, well, how inheritance law worked for rich people in Europe, how some groups were gaining power, the ability and socialization of men within military traditions, all these other factors that produce a much more binary and, for the first time, specifically dichotomous, right? Not necessarily just saying there are two categories, but we should be able to define you as one or the other, and any characteristic or aspect associated with one should not be practiced by the other. And famously, the social scientist Michel Foucault wrote about the process by which the behaviors of sexuality, which had never been associated with the biological sex and reproductive sex as cleanly as they were in the Victorian era, became modified like that. That, for example, you can't define sexuality the way we do in the modern world unless you've already got this idea that sexuality should only ever be legitimate if it's related to reproduction. And believe it or not, even in religious traditions in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the production of the idea that we should only ever have sex for reproduction is very modern, right? It is incredibly recent in the history of the world and those religions. And it's still fought over, right? There are still groups within the Catholic Church who argue that within marriage, sex for pleasure is a gift from God. And there are people in the Catholic Church who argue that sex for pleasure is a temptation away from the grace of God. And there are people within the nature of how marriage works in Orthodox Judaism, who argue that providing pleasure to your spouse, not as a reproductive act, but providing pleasure to your spouse, is part of the covenant between spouses, right? That like there's really like a Toranic there's a way to interpret Torah that says you're actually responsible to give your wife orgasms. And it's not that that's necessarily the dominant idea, but that the idea that these things are fundamentally and absolutely essentialized together, that all sex revolves around reproductive biology, that all gender revolves around biological sex, and that sexuality, your interest, your appreciation for in a romantic or sexual interest way, must revolve around the reproductive act also, not for pleasure, not for these other things, but for that historically goes back. We can see in the history of as written by somebody like Thomas LaCour or Elizabeth Lloyd, we can look at these historians' work who track when that first becomes the dominant way to talk, and it really is relatively recent. And then what we have is within the last 100 years, as various groups, including gay rights groups, including anti-colonialization and imperialist groups who are arguing for the permission to think and use and wonder about traditional ways of knowing, as well as a global movement around gender rights for women. All of these things have brought questions back to that strong dichotomous nature of sex, where, for instance, the act of sex, if it is not reproductive, shouldn't be of interest to women. And we still see a lot of these things as being encoded in and influencing the social formations of sex, sexuality, and gender today. But at the same time, we've seen the proliferation and improvement of the way we handle that diversity in many ways. So almost cleanly, there's a generational split where, for instance, above the age of 25, there are a lot of people who are homophobic. There are a lot of people who are heteronormative or transphobic. And that there is a really significant decrease in rates of those discriminatory or prejudiced beliefs as you get younger. And so exposure to the various alternative institutional structures, things like genderqueer pride, things like transgender rights, those have produced an ability to reconsider and understand it in a way that socializes youth. Now, that the real danger there is that if we don't then really build the actual institutions, if we don't provide legal and political and structural protections, then all of a sudden you can have work that reduces that in training, and this socialization moves in the other direction. And you can see a lot of political efforts in that direction, right? You have, for example, the Florida law that in combination says, well, everybody knows that there's something vaguely about sexuality that has to do with being in drag. And a student got very upset when I said this last semester in class, that I said, look, I'm not saying it's sexy, I'm not saying it's sexual, but there is something related to our social construction of sexuality about being in drag. And in our social system, anything that has to do with sexuality is related to the act of sex. And that means that the Florida law that says, for example, if you do anything that is even vaguely related to sex as an act, sexuality as sexuality in front of children, you are potentially doing something that is harmful to them. That isn't true, but it is logically consistent with the linkages of these categories in our culture. So, for instance, it turns out that there is no evidence to show that drag shows for children have any negative effect except for the reinforcing of the drag show as being a legitimate and non-deviant thing. But for people who see it as deviant at a fundamental level or an essentialized level to begin with, recognizing that that is destigmatizing that thing is in itself problematic to them. Now, that system of heteronormativity and that system of anti-trans or anti. I mean, it's sort of weird because being in drag is crossing gender normal boundaries. Um, that said, certainly there is no reason to believe, no evidence to say that it is particularly transgender in the contemporary usage, but in the sense that you are transgressive, it is transgender. And so it is complicated to look at that because I've said before, and I'll say again, the problem with thinking of these things in absolutes is that we tend on either side to not recognize that there is an ongoing process of production, right? So if you like that the work, the active work of reinstitutionalizing or changing institutions of gender allows for non-binary identities, allows it to be put onto a license, driver's license in some places, allows it to be used to decrease structural heteronormativity, right? The fact that you're allowed to have marital protections for for same-sex spouses or for non uh, gender normative spouses, spouse just being a wife or a husband as recognized. But literally those protections and recognitions as components in those categories, those are being made and they're being attacked. And over time, the actions of individuals and groups within the society will determine these configurations. So what we're looking at then is how crossing boundaries and how production of these categories of identity are political and institutional acts. It's strange to me to be about to do this next little bit because we can talk. I mean, I can talk about Judith Butler and Irving Goffman and performativity, but I really do want you to understand that there is a fundamental strangeness, a disconcerting aspect of being a cisgender, heteronormative, white male who's, if you think in terms of a spectrum of sexual orientation, I'm pretty well all the way at one end attracted to women, right? So when we think about these things, there is a weird power imbalance about me giving you this lecture. And one of the reasons that that's true is because we are able to recognize that the performance, the enactment, or in the last slide, the discussion of socialization, having a very normal or normatively expected person in the role of defending the non-normative is unusual, in part because we are able to generally expect that somebody in power is going to be less likely to question that which gives them power. And one of the real sad things about it is that the act of teaching this, the act of doing this at an individual level is so limited in its effect that I'm not really weakening anything. I'm not really changing it. What I am doing, or at least what I would argue I'm doing, is offering a perspective that allows in aggregate the possibility of your own actions and thinking being slightly different. So here's the way this is. The institutions of gender, like all institutions, include both specified roles and systematic relations that are replicated, reproduced, instructed, and enforced. And historically, in the world at large, there were many different systems of gender. Every society, every local culture would have variations. There are still extant, that is, still existing groups of people who, for example, do believe that there are 3, 4, 5 different genders. In a current tradition or a current configuration of beliefs that goes hundreds of years or thousands of years into the past. Within the last millennia, within the last 500 years, the assumption of a European origin, binary and dichotomous system of gender was widely built into the institutions of gender for much of the world. And that was done in very specific and structured ways. For instance, through the introduction of the technology of birth certificates in colonial authorities throughout the world. So if you were in a tribal culture in Africa that had three genders, and all of a sudden you were colonized, they didn't have to teach you not to think in terms of three genders. They just had to build those institutions, schools where girls wore one uniform and boys wore another, and you had to pick one or the other. When you have a kid, you get your birth certificate, and you don't have a legitimate kid if you don't have a birth certificate, and you have to pick boy or girl on the birth certificate. And that we literally build the binary through the production of all of those compounding and collecting institutions. Those smaller, both specific and formal institutions replicate and participate in making the larger social institution of gender. And as we use the social institution of gender, we also see it become replicated in science. So the same period of time that medical science is developing as a way to understand the world is the period of time where this set of stuff about gender is being built into all these institutions. And don't get me wrong, some of that binary gender aspect had been present before in some places, but it had never been considered universal. So one of the things that begins happening is those institutions, as a way to enforce, begin to erase diversity and verification, or the capacity for verification of alternatives. And one of the classic examples of this is that we have this famous story of one of the popes where all the language about them makes it seem like the pope was probably a woman, except everything written after their lifetime refers to them as a man. They weren't very important. It may not be clear. And I like the indeterminacy, the questionableness of it. Like, were they transgender? Were they just, as a form of respect, treated as one of the boys later? Or, as is the most dominant theory, the most dominant explanation for why they are rewritten in history as male, because we want to make it conform to the removal of women from offices within the Holy Church. And that happens at a certain point where early on it just wasn't the case. You could have women priests, you could have women deacons, and depending on who you ask, you might have been able to have a bishop and a pope. But that later, as we begin to produce this categorical idea that there are things that men do and things that women do, and we begin to enforce it using different institutions, other institutions replicate that divide and reinforce it also. And so this labeling construction process that produces the social formations, which are particularly important for large-scale social institutions, begin to label or ascribe different behaviors. And especially for those times where you're not in a formal institution, you're not at school, you're not there, you're not in a hospital, you're not at church. There's this question of how those categories and ideas become important, enforced, socialized, reprocessed, or replicated. And that's where this idea by Goffman and Butler and others about performativity is. Right? Think about if I came into class swishing my hips side to side. Think about how that would make you respond to me as a teacher, right? Would it change the way you paid attention, the credibility you gave? If I came into class wearing a dress, would it change the ability for you to take serious what I said? If I came to class and I told you that I was transgender or actually just a bearded woman or whatever, how would those things change the interaction between us? And that part of what we want to talk about with performativity, particularly around gender, is that there is a back and forth process where what you are is not to some degree known or defined until the actions, the behaviors, the performance is seen and responded to. And that ability for people's enactment or response to how you are perceived, changing who you are to them, makes a big difference. In in the 10th anniversary of Judith Butler's book on gender trouble, is her first big book or her main book on this idea of performativity. In the 10-year anniversary edition, she writes in the introduction that the anticipation of an authoritative disclosure of meaning is the means by which that authority is attributed and installed. The anticipation conjures its object. And I don't know that that sentence will mean a lot to you, so let me explain. The anticipation, the waiting for, and the knowing, or at least thinking you know how others will respond, makes you act in a different way, right? And she says specifically this authoritative disclosure of meaning. See, and this is the thing about performativity that we sometimes forget. You don't get to act any way you want. Only some behaviors, only some actions can be interpreted by others. The repertory, the list, the categories, the ways you get to be have to match those authoritative disclosures of meaning. If they don't, then you're producing chaos. You're unable to predict how people will respond. And we don't have infinite choice. So one of the things that's amazing then in the discussion of gender identity over the years is the work to produce labels and choices, to produce new options for how to express yourself, how to be identified by others, how to respond to others, and how to be able to offer something to be understood. All have changed. And it's difficult if you grow up at a time where you have those options, even if they're constantly under attack, right? There are people who are conservative who are constantly attacking the legitimacy of the very category, the very label, the option or the reference of being transgender or non-binary or queer, right? And there was a time where the same thing was true for homosexuality and the language of it. Less than 200 years ago, there wasn't a language to identify gay or lesbian or homosexual in the same way because we didn't have the same system by which those behaviors and identities were interpreted by others. And those changes over time are the product of people and institution working in different ways to make things different. And Goffman's pessimism that almost all of this performativity will result from or will respond to the fear of stigmatization doesn't work that way for Butler. Butler argues that the anticipation, the wondering, the waiting, the thinking about your performance at an unconscious level isn't a singular act. That at the same time, it's a repetition and a ritual that is of a kind of interpretation that you know how people will do. And while it sometimes achieves what she calls the effect of naturalization, that ability to be read is always changing over time. It's always part of that cultural moment or that social moment in which you live. But that where Butler, who is a fairly butch woman, wants us to recognize is that there are just as many opportunities by which we are, rather than disappearing into the expectations, into the way that we want anticipation of how we will be read. She says we're always using those options. We're always using those aspects that we think we can't necessarily act the way other people expect us to. We use those to produce difference in ways that we can control, to seek appreciation, to seek social production of a different kind of identity. So the the idea for her is that yes, nobody wants to be stigmatized. That's in the name, right? She says, of course you don't want to be stigmatized. But the idea that we would all therefore basically always be trying to be normal, that's not how people respond to that. Because not everybody can be normal. Not everybody's going to be able to make that choice. And in other parts of Goffman, he actually talks about this also. He says, look, for instance, if you're poor, you can't dress like a rich person. You're going to have to choose to perform the activities of a poor person. But how you do that is going to be about trying to minimize the stigmatization. And Butler says, maybe it's a difference of the time, maybe it's a difference of the way it works, but especially when we talk about sex and gender, there are all these internal features of the self, all this inner life that gets tangled up in it. And a huge amount of that isn't just going to be about how people or institutions interact and respond to us in a day. There are going to be parts of that which are about producing and shaping who we are over a much longer term. The debate or the status of these constructions, whether you're talking about race or in her particular focus, sex and gender and sexuality, no single account will work. No single action will work. Performativity doesn't work that way. It isn't about one interaction. And that process by which identity is formed comes about throughout your entire life. And one of the things that's dramatic, one of the things that's visible and problematic to some people and glorious to other people in the process of gender identity transitions is that they are a sudden version of something that takes a lifetime otherwise. And I had a student who I got into a large argument about last semester because she identified as being sort of, not clear on why and if gender identity was real. And I had another student in the same class who they were non-binary, femme presenting, but non-binary, and they were fascinated by the idea of detransitioning. And we got into a long argument because I don't like the language of detransitioning, because detransitioning may include very positive experiences of people who felt pressured to be hyper feminine. They transitioned to being a woman rather than non-binary. And they, as a non-binary person, saw this option opening up for people where they were pressured to feel you had to be trans into a very traditional gender role instead of being non-binary, and people could transition back out. And I said, the problem with that is that the moment you talk about detransitioning, A, you're presuming that this is an isolated thing. And so I said, what you're talking about sounds more like retransitioning or ongoing transition. And because the people who are experiencing it use the word detransition, I'm not going to say they're wrong, but I think there's a secondary element to that becomes complicated because in the same world you have a lot of people who are incredibly heteronormative and homophobic and trans exclusionary who are talking about detransitioning, and their point in talking about it is to show that nobody is really transgender, that people choose to detransition. That's delegitimizing the category. And part of my point isn't to say that one person is right or one person is wrong. The social encoding that meant I had one student who didn't think anybody could be non-binary, because she sort of had to pick a team to her. And the student who thought that we should recognize and respect the choice to be detransitioned from being all the way trans. Those are parts of this ongoing process. But all of it is complicated because no matter who you are, that you are producing, performing, and changing in your gender identity and your gender role and your gender expression over your lifetime should already be background, but because it is essentialized, Butler asks us to pause and say that's where we're really being transgressive, right? You're supposed to pretend that the categories are absolute and unchanging. And we'd have the same kind of discussion about it being transgressive or deviant to recognize categorical changes. We're supposed to, for example, in American culture, we often are expected to think of old people as asexual, and then you have a lot of discomfort and difficulty in getting a real discussion of the fact that one of the largest communities that has to worry about sexually transmitted diseases is old people in old folks' homes, because you're throwing bored people together in a place where, among other things, you no longer have to worry. They're in large part no longer fertile, which means you don't have to worry about pregnancies, which means for many of them, skipping condoms or other disease prevention techniques becomes unnecessary. And that conversation is very hard because the expectation and identity of gender in old age shifts in Western culture often to thinking of old people as a gender, not one gender, but lacking gender, non-gendered. And and so Judith Butler wants us to recognize that these things are complicated. I mean, in the same way that, if you're my aunt's generation of lesbians, where lots of non-feminine gender presentation happened, but it was almost always going to be interpreted in the 1970s, 1980s as being butch and lesbian, right? Taking people out of that community and into the non-binary identity label, moving people into other categories, the question then becomes, is the older community that had a different meaning and a different understanding of those categories, is that other community going to lose out? And I don't think that she or anybody else wants to deny those categories because of that, but it is part of what's happening, right? As you redefine, as you change these resources, simply the performance and use of this stuff changes those meanings for other people. So, in the last slide, I was talking about performativity and the ongoing production of gender through its enactment, its reinforcement, the questioning of it. And I think sometimes people forget that we're not talking about one person alone. It is through the compound action, the group action, the societal scale actions that these things happen. So individual actions, individual performances add up. Think of the beach is not one grain of sand. It is lots of grains of sand. And it's really important that despite the hyper-individualism of American culture, it really does take people working together to change these things. And the production of categories, the question of how things work and how you make these things happen, that's a real thing where we look at how groups of people have done it. So the production throughout the late 1700s into the 19th century, leading up to around 1900, is a process by which institutions structurally for about 120 years produce a really strongly homophobic process. And there are a lot of historical reasons for that, but by the late 1920s, in the United States, in Europe, and most other parts of the world where Europeans have colonized and enforced those systems, there are legal and structural barriers to acceptance of gay identities. And what ends up happening is you produce non-normative spaces, gay bars, lesbian bars, coffee houses where people were allowed to play with identity, play with sexuality. And some of those were very successful at producing a countercultural space. Between 1920 and about the 1950s in the United States, for a whole lot of political reasons, the U.S. Policing system, both social and the legal police, had strong attacks against the gay community. Now, depending on how you measure it, um, it's easy to think of the gay community as being much smaller then, but what you got to remember is that we have every reason to believe, based on what are called historical survey, that we had a pretty consistent number of people who, if they were allowed to be gay or lesbian, about the same number, somewhere on that order of 1 in 10 people would be at least some of the time homosexual. And what ends up happening is that more and more people have to be closeted as the strictures, as the sanctions, as the norms, as the systems work to prevent acting upon those attractions. And in some places, you get things like the language Polari in England, where in order to use a crypto language, that is a language meant to conceal. Some people would argue that it's a cant, a C-A-N-T, that is an explicitly code system for hiding meaning, not a language of its own. That's a linguistic argument we could have another time. But Polari was literally a language so you could talk about gay stuff in front of other people and not get punished for it. And you get systems like that in all sorts of places. You get coding of how we talk about things to prevent individually being marked as deviant, but particularly to prevent the sanctions or the punishments and enforcement of norms that you're breaking. And historically, there becomes, not the first time, there were a number of conflicts around this, including a number of large-scale riots. Famously, the Stonewall riots in New York happened because the police are actually breaking the law to go punish gay people in the village. And they're arresting people without a legal basis because the law was very unclear about how and where you could punish people for being gay. And the community, which had been increasingly working to produce spaces where they were allowed to be expressing themselves freely, responds by fighting the police so that they will not be arrested. And to some extent, from that period in the 70s to today, the recognition that the way to achieve greater gay rights was to force these issues out in the open, to actually challenge them, becomes central. And we see the same thing in the fight for women's rights. And in a minute, we'll be talking about the history of feminism as the example. We could talk more potentially in class about how there are parallels and differences between the gay rights movement and the women's movement and the feminist movement. But the same thing happens where simply educating other women, simply talking to other women about what the problems are, initially happens, and that the recognition that unless you're making it a public issue, unless you're changing the effects on other people, the capacity to have that debate is limited. And so it's very easy to imagine now that like men were sexist, but then, women basically went around and went, we're people too, we should have rights. And that was a logical debate. But for instance, one of the largest soccer fields in England gets lit on fire by suffragettes because they wouldn't let women go to soccer games, right? They storm buildings and demonstrate, they publicly demonstrate where those barriers of bias or discrimination are, right? You don't want us in your banks, we'll go sit down on the floor of your bank. And how those processes work, similarly to the civil rights movement, it often is about saying this is part of that process of social construction that is unacceptable, and that because those things become invisible, essentialized, and naturalized, it takes a lot of work by a lot of people to get those things to be made visible and questionable again. And again, it it isn't possible to separate those early riots from the later marches, right? They had to produce the space to be seen as a political issue by having done the deviant actions of rioting, of protests that were violent or structurally more resisted early on. And you see that debate discussed now where we want to be allowed to have women's rights marches, we want to have civil rights marches, but even those marches are considered inappropriate if they're not to some degree contrasted to stronger social actions, right? If you're not threatening a riot, the march isn't a thing that happens. And that becomes a real challenge as we talk about sex and gender because, for instance, one of the central elements that begins to show in the construction of gendered expectations for women is that they're not supposed to be confrontational. You're not supposed to be yelling. You're not supposed to be violent. Like the characteristics that would allow these kinds of confrontations are intentionally being denied. And in so doing, what you see is that the gendered construction produces a stratification or a hierarchical relationship where political actions are allowed for men and denied to women. And that's not an accident, right? This is, for example, the historically women had the right in Europe to own property to some degree. I mean, to some degree, only the king could own property in many parts of Europe, but you get the idea. And over time, the right to own property, to inherit, to do these things was stripped away from women and placed with men. And in some cases, the argument was that it was freeing women from a burden. Not necessarily true, but that was the argument. And in some cases, it was the insistence that women were incapable of these things. And in some cases, it was just completely invisible that it was done. But over time, those changes in the political organization of society and institutions around gender were eventually recognized and then questioned, and we get the civil rights movement and these other social movements that are about modifying the direction or producing different social change. In the chapter, they make reference to the fact that there are different eras of feminism. And I think it's worth talking about this because, for instance, this is often something that if you don't know about, it's hard to see why and how certain aspects of both the perception of feminism became so negative, but also there are elements like the TERF movement in feminists, or what might be called feminists, who are anti-trans. We can understand how those conflicts over categories, ideas, and politics, how they exist today in part as a result of these past moments. So we are arguably in what's called the fourth wave of feminism. The first wave of feminism, the emphasis in those social actions, the burning down the stadium, trying to take over the Parliament Hall, passing out pamphlets, getting in fights with the cops. In New York City, there were at one point there was a dress strike where women put pants on. I mean, there are these incredibly serious things which significant people would literally get beaten in the street for wearing pants. And you have this process where you literally are saying, look, forget the cultural stuff, forget the issues of gender. Law is divided based on sex, and the law should apply to everybody, right? And one of the things that's really weird about this is that we can look at this wave of feminism not as being about all laws, but it's about certain institutions, right? Particularly about the courthouse and voting. And so the argument is that the law as an institution, the courthouse, the lawyers, the law, it is obviously meant to apply to everybody equally. It's in the Magna Carta, it's in the rules that were produced to produce the Parliament in England, it's in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence here, right? There is a basis that is unarguable that if women are people, they should be protected equally under the law. at least where the law is. And so the first wave of feminism is really very specifically fighting about that. And there are these weird moments like the dress strikes in New York, like smoking in public, which was considered socially bad by a lot of people in New York. Women weren't supposed to smoke cigarettes. I mean, now we know smoking is bad, but at the time, smoking was a very normative thing. Everybody was sort of expected to smoke if you were a man, but women weren't allowed to smoke publicly. And so literally, it was about taking these moments where you could get a group of women together to say, look, this is a legally protected action, but you're going to punish us for doing it even though men are allowed to do it, right? Everybody is supposed to get a vote, but men get the vote and women don't. Look, everybody is allowed to sign a contract and have it be legally binding. Why can't I? And that first wave of feminism effectively leads to significant changes in how law works in many countries. And this takes a little later, where imperial or colonial authorities are stricter. So the less ability to change you allow in a society, the less social change happens. And so in one class, a student pointed out that these stories, the process of suffragettes and fighting for the right to vote, that happens in India, and but it happens a little later because quite literally the ability to enforce norms and institutional structures without variation, it is easier to be brutal and absolute in a country where you're policing a subject population rather than yourself. And so we see this first wave. I mean, on this chart, it listed until 1915 on the top one, 1960 on the bottom one. And I want to simply say, depending on where you're looking, this is very much an ongoing process, and it never ends, right? We can see the discussion of critical race theory and the expansion of attempts to remove discrimination in law today as a natural extension of the attempts to produce equality under law in first wave feminism. Once there are minimal legal protections, once you have the right to vote, once you have the right to go and make a complaint in court, once you have the right to file a police report, it gives you a tool to talk about other things. So for instance, if a contract with a woman is not legally enforceable, there's no way to have equal economic relations. If there's no way to own your own home, if there's no way to provide for yourself in the economy, then that legal ability to vote doesn't matter for much because you're still dependent on your husband, you're dependent on your father. And so having found the capacity of political action is expanded by legal rights, we see the expansion of the use of those legal rights to bring complaint about inequality in other institutional spheres. And so the expansion in the second wave of feminism, which again, depending on how you mark it, really begins in the 1940s. And we don't hear that history much, but for instance, all of the 1940s, women go to the factories during World War II. Well, second wave feminism began earlier than that because you already have protests about unfair pay. Like somebody knows that their husband did this job and got paid a certain amount. Now the woman comes and does it. Well, they're getting half as much. And we see those same questions, right? Doesn't necessarily begin with second wave feminism. Those fights begin earlier, but we recognize the ability to have those fights, to negotiate, to perform, and to enact the discussion of those other kinds of rights and debates changes after the implementation and the effect of legal rights are defended. Right. So as you move through that period, it's not really that first wave ends and second wave begins. It's that people had been making the complaints, had been performing and enacting different kinds of issues throughout the first wave. But without the legal structures that were the wins in the first wave, you could not make that happen in the second wave. Second wave feminism also begins to split along certain issues, and different groups see it in different ways. One of the big ones is there is a tendency within feminism to try to look at all women as being one group. And so during second wave feminism, relatively early on, some issues become clearly intersectional, right? What a certain thing looks like for black women is different than for white women. And some of that is about economic conditions as much as it is race. So there are lots of people who would argue that what we're looking at is really what you're looking at is women who have economic advantage and position, women who don't, women who are first world or from the developing world with legal protections associated with being part of the dominant group versus people in the developing world or people in areas where they are subject to the dominant group. And so what happens is you see these things splitting. And you get people like Catherine McKinnon, who's arguably sociologist or philosopher, who talks about the fact that there is inherent power relations in male and female relations, being penetrated or not penetrated. And she famously says that feminism needs to look at all sex with men as rape. And then you have other people who come along, including Judith Butler, who come along and say, that's ridiculous, right? You're just essentializing sex in a different way, but you're not getting rid of the essentialization. What we want is more freedom, more attention to the mechanisms by which we can get different things. And throughout the second wave feminist movement, one of the things that begins to happen is what sometimes gets called difference feminism or gender essentialism for progress. And so, as I said, as we begin to see all women or all black women or all developing world women as being classes of people who need political access, who need things to change, there is a sort of deepening or an entrenching of that idea of woman as central to it. And so one of the things that begins to happen as you move into third wave feminism is that as the emphasis on gender identity, as the emphasis on queer rights and gay rights and the protections for people who are trans and intersex, as those other forms of identity and categories come in, there begins to be what's called a split between trans exclusionary feminism, where at a logical level it is them saying, look, if we've based legal rights for women on this definition of women, on this idea of biological sex, and we get rid of that, then chances are we're erasing all the progress over the last 100 years. And that's their argument. And then there are other people who say we're not trans exclusionary. Our goal is, well, yeah, we want women to maintain these rights and we should make sure they maintain them, but you can't maintain those rights at the expense. The defense of those rights can't be at the expense of other people's rights. And so there's a split between trans exclusionary radical feminism and radical feminism. And one of the parts of that split as you move into third wave and into fourth wave feminism is how much the arguments for feminism are still based on a fundamental continuity of gender. And in particular, theories like the performative work of Judith Butler or of a set of work by somebody like Donna Haraway, who argues for what she calls the cyborg theory of life, where everybody is a mix of all sorts of stuff, where our focus becomes on protecting everybody who is discriminated against, as opposed to just protecting women as a category. Their argument is, you're right, that is a problem, but if we change our tactics, it's a problem that can be surmounted. And those fights begin to happen in ways that lead to, for example, the conflict that we now see with many people being upset about somebody like J.K. Rowling, who, along with other problems, is a gender essentialist. She argues that there is a fundamental essential nature to women, and that it is, if anything, an insult to women that somebody could pretend to be one. And the fact that we have real arguments to argue that that's not true, that there isn't this universal essentialized nature of women, that these aspects of the world that she is relying on and that she then says we should use to effectively punish people who disagree with it. That is the result of the sense of precarity, or at least part of what produces that is the sense of precarity of those victories. And it's particularly both ironic in that it is not what you'd expect, but it's particularly um, inappropriate to use that position when you are nearly a billionaire, when you have that level of economic and social standing that J.K. Rowling has. Whereas I have a lot more sympathy for somebody who is struggling on a day-to-day basis and feels like anybody else getting something is going to take it away from them. That I understand why somebody's perspective would be narrow in that situation. But one of the things that ends up happening is that we also see that when you have these positions, like I said about the weird thing about me giving a lecture as a cis white hetero guy, is that when we see somebody who's in a position of power, often they will be refuse or they will be reticent or unwilling to accept things that could potentially diminish the structural or institutional power they have. And so one of the things we'll recognize is, and whether you're seeing criticisms online of something like white feminism or white women's feminism or Karen feminism, where we use the language and structure of feminism is seen to be basically a way for them to maintain their position. Those issues become complicated because there is still just a tremendous amount of discrimination and bias that's still connected to sex and gender as well as sexuality in the world. And the kinds of discussions here, one of the things that ends up happening, for example, is that if we track where and how real work of changing people's mind, alternative socialization, thinking about options are, one of the classic issues then becomes a question about, well, if this is happening like in novels, in books for women, in stuff that's taken less seriously by society, because there's a gender bias, how do we make sense of that, right? And so the issue as we move into third wave then becomes all of these things are in conflict. There's this shift to talk about all these differences, all these different forms of identity, an emphasis on culture, and in part because we're now talking about complexity and multiple forms of identity and doing it intersectionally, talking about performativity, there is a shift from large scale things like reproductive rights at this federal law level to how people talk about pornography. And the recognition that we have to, at the same time, work at those very high levels and very low levels presents a real challenge, because if somebody is criticizing a behavior as opposed to a large scale system, it's very easy for people to feel criticized themselves. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Recognizing that you are part of that system of behavior that reinforces and structures discrimination is challenging. But one of the things that the feminist movement in the third and fourth wave begin to say is that the more productive thing, rather than resisting when you see those kinds of feelings arise, is to recognize that that outrage or anxiety should be a sign that you should be arguing against the large scale system that produces it, rather than seeing it as an insult for yourself. So what's happening throughout these eras of feminism, we could see paralleled again in the discussion of history of the waves or eras of gay rights, and how that moves through and in and parallel to the eras of feminism and social change. We could see the same kinds of discussions if you saw suffrage and the approach of attempting to get legal rights among women. That's very much the same set of questions about the emancipation and suffrage of African Americans or of other minority groups and the extension of voting rights, right? We see these same processes, and the efficacy or the structural capacity to make change, because of how institutions and social structures work, it tends to follow certain patterns like this, right? If you're legally not allowed to do anything, you have to change the law first, and then you begin working on these other things. And then once you do those things, you expand different protections to allow you to talk and think in different ways. All of a sudden, there's a whole bunch of other things that we can recognize as contributing to those systems. One of the reasons to look at the history of feminism, look at the construction of these things, is to really be able to understand that these are not static processes. How the ideas of sex, sexuality, and gender, how the identities and institutions that participate in making up these larger systematic and social structures, how that all works is changing all the time. And we have 100 little pieces that we play with, both as part of the performative prospect, that is what we are able to choose between to perform, but also in the way it's built into other things. And the politics of technologies, the politics of laws, a lot of what that is highly flexible, because what is built in shapes which interpretations are likely, right? So how you put pockets on pants, whether you make them large and of greater use, whether you make them small because you are preserving the look of the pants as an aesthetic choice, how and when you want to look at that um, is often seen as being trivial, that the pockets issue isn't important. But it has a variety of systematic effects, and it has a variety of interlinked elements. The presumption that women must wear makeup leads to the presumption that you'll carry a lot of stuff around with you rather than just a wallet and a phone. Therefore, there's a direct relationship between those heteronormative and gender-specific expectations and norms that produce how a pair of pants are cut or how pockets are shaped and sized, as well as other elements. And the difference in how things around us are labeled as gendered because they are one thing or another, not by talking about the function. So, for example, in many cases, the difference, aside from a mild difference in palette of smells between men's deodorant and women's deodorant, is the expectation that women will shave off any hair means that the men's deodorant has prioritized in design that it won't make hair stick together and clump. And similarly, the expectation that women will wear tighter clothing means that many women's deodorants include an anti-chafing stuff. So there are differences in function, and it's not like people couldn't make choices based on those, right? If you want something that won't make your hair stick together and clump in this way, buy this one. But instead of that, we reinforce and respond to those complex systems of gender expectations and norms in different ways and encode them in different ways. Now, the basic premise that we are working through here is that there is always going to be an availability of decision making. That is a flexibility within limits. And so we police and shape the boundaries all the time by the selection or the performance of actions, implementing our responses to the norms or their breaking, our sanctioning or our disapproval, our approval, our positive reinforcement. And what ends up happening is that there are certain things that end up having different effects, not because of themselves, but in their negotiation. And I was surprised recently to see this discussion of the Ohio law that forces transgender candidates to use their dead name on ballots, right? This is a, 60-year-old rule. And one of the things that I thought was hilarious about this is that the original basis of this rule was the presumption and reality that some people would try to hide past crimes by changing their name. But in effect, the law has never been enforced based on gender, or it would require everybody who's ever changed their name in marriage, which would include, when I looked it up, every single woman who's ever run for state office in Ohio in that time would have to have been running on her birth name, her married name, not being allowed because it's a change of name. And what we're seeing here is that, yes, there is a stable law, but that the interpretation on what counts, the social construction of what counts as a name change, is very flexible. And so what we see is that there is a specific set of politics built in, and those politics are then negotiated or reinterpreted around that central device, right? If a bathroom has a urinal in it, it is much more difficult for a woman, presumably, to use the urinal, but it doesn't make the toilet any more difficult to use. So we often use the presence of a urinal as a mark that it's a men's bathroom. But in fact, there's no reason that we would say the toilet is harder for a woman to use. In fact, if you might be just a guy who likes to sit down when you pee. You don't have to stand up to pee. And how you use the bathroom has a ton of flexibility. But then we have these other systems of encoding or expectations that are socialized into us and negotiated and performed. And that's all part of what we talked about as the expectation within dominant or normative practice to be reproduced. And so we see that the social reproduction of gender ideas gets built into and is processed through lots of different things. And that's why in the later stage feminism, we see fights about all these different things, because it's going to be eventually harder to have real debates about the nature of gender, real debates about decreasing discrimination, real debates about getting rid of prejudice, real debates about salary differences, about real things, if every day people are being reminded that women are curvy and white in their deodorant and men are stocky and gray in their deodorant, that process of making difference matters. And so as we move through these debates, we're seeing that culture and social expectations are produced and negotiated all the time. So in a minute, we'll move to contemporary issues around discrimination and gender and sexuality. But I wanted to take a minute to just wrap up this previous discussion slide about things around us and the technologies and architectures around us structuring and affecting how we think about gender. And I think we could use lots of different examples. We could talk about the fact that, for example, most automobiles in the United States were designed for people who were tall, because there had originally been a sexist presumption, a sexist assumption that men would be doing the driving and women would be passengers. So almost all of the heights from the floor to the dashboard were based on a body height of 6 foot, because who wants to admit that they need a car built for a short man? And things like the crash test, safety testing for cars were done based on a 6 foot person with a large body size. And so all sorts of aspects of car design then became shaped by what our gendered expectations of behavior were. And then once you built the car, it turned out that, for instance, using a gigantic steering wheel to respond to the lack of power steering meant that upper body strength did make it more comfortable to drive for men. Whereas using a different system of responding to the mechanical necessities of car design at the time might have allowed it to be more flexible or more available to women. And even after we see the introduction of power steering, the design of car user interfaces, of the steering column, etc., still continue throughout the 1970s and 80s into the early 90s to be largely biased, because we're still expecting somebody who's of a larger size to work. Now, interestingly, it turns out that over time, as nutritional and other things affected, height has been going up on average for women and men. There's a variety of things where it turns out that some of those effects of the design of cars become less affecting over time. But the example that I wanted to go back to was the introduction of microwaves. That microwaves were introduced right around the end of World War II, and they were offered as a high-speed alternative to traditional ovens. And the designers were largely of the opinion that women were crazy for not wanting them. But there was a fairly straightforward issue that if you'd spent your life learning how to cook and then you were told cook in a different way, a lot of your knowledge was eliminated. A lot of it was made less practicable. And at the time, there was a dramatic resurgence. Women were being kicked out of jobs they'd done during the war. Men were returning to the office. There was a resurgence of societal pressure for people to do things both traditionally, but also using traditional gendered expectations that were, in fact, in many cases, enhancing and getting more sexist in the 1950s than they had been before the war. And into that circumstance, you have the microwave come in, where it's just a new kind of oven. And their argument was you should be able to cook with it faster and better. You'll have more time to do your other chores. And women are like, I would have to entirely relearn how to cook. And they didn't sell. Nobody wanted a microwave. As the 50s and 60s wear on into the 70s, and we see more women moving into the workforce, and for a whole lot of reasons, the amount of time that women are spending cooking goes down. Men are expected to do a little more cooking. And there's a lot of resistance to that. There's a whole number of technologies like microwave meals, like TV dinners, and the invention of ready-to-eat food and the expansion of to-go culture and fast food are all responses to the desire not to learn to cook, or the desire not to have to spend as much time cooking. And all of a sudden, in the 1970s, there is a sudden reappearance of microwaves. And one of the things that happens is, instead of trying to say you're cooking in the microwave, there is a real effort to show that this is not making fun of the microwave. This is really the way it was advertised as much as anything else. You're not cooking, you're zapping, you're nuking, you're speedy reheating. And the idea changes from being a substitution cooking device to something which can be used by people who don't cook. And in particular, they emphasize that you don't have to know how to cook. You don't have to know what ingredients go into things. The goal here is just to quickly zap things. And microwaves become, after having initially been attempted to be gender coded for women as a kitchen device, they are rapidly transitioned in the 1980s into a device that allows men to use the kitchen without cooking, without being connected to kitchen stuff. And we can talk more about the way that gendered labor works in another slide. We can talk about the fact that cooking is a woman's thing, but being a chef, being a professional and a serious artist about it, that's still gendered male in very specific ways. We can talk about those complexities, but microwaves, you still see this within there, that there are often controls that allow you to do more nuanced cooking, do this or that. But one of the ways that you design those controls is specifically to be able to remove past expectations about what you know. Right? So for instance, it used to use other language, but a lot of the time they'll now have like you're cooking a fresh vegetable. Is it hard or soft? And rather than having a different way to talk about a vegetable, to ask you that, which requires you to know how things are often cooked, they're literally like, you don't need to know. You just poke it. Is it hard or is it soft? And if it's a soft vegetable, it gets this long. If it's a hard vegetable, it gets this long. The actual design is based around the idea that you can choose not to be a cook. And that process, which reinforces who is required to know how to cook, particularly in Western Europe and the United States, is a thing that is heavily gendered. And how that particular labor gets translated into the object of a microwave to produce those ideas. That's where we'll say that this object became gendered. So while the kitchen it's in may be gendered female or feminine when it is complicated in that way, the microwave itself is decontextualized and can be seen as not cooking in a masculine way. And this goes so far as to say that, for instance, in many offices where the code would not allow the preparation of food, you can have a microwave and a refrigerator for people to warm something up, even though you are capable of doing cooking in a microwave. But because it's not cooking, it is not cooking. And as soon as we recognize that pattern of not cooking, we're talking about a gendered expectation about skills and the definition of the labor and the object as gendered. The nature of gendering things such as objects, professions, is one of those things that people are often very uncomfortable with, in part because recognizing that you're carrying those beliefs around means that you're often forced to recognize that you're carrying around discriminatory or biased beliefs. But we do studies on this stuff all the time, and it turns out that even medical professionals tend to gender medicine in certain ways. So we see that far more often, whether you're a man or a woman, if you're presented with a photo of somebody in scrubs that's a woman, people will guess nurse. And if you're presented with a picture of somebody in scrubs who's a man, you guess doctor. And it turns out that if you look at the pictures below, we have one group where a couple people are in lab coats and a couple people aren't. And one of the things that people will often do is go, well, obviously the back row, which has these men, and this one woman in a lab coat, those are the doctors, the front row are the nurses. Or you look at the other one and say, well, this group has lab coats and more men, and this one has more women. And that, in fact, none of these people are doctors or nurses. All these are actually models. These are in the left-hand side. None of these people are doctors or nurses. That's models for a scrubs company selling you scrubs. In the right-hand side, the group there are, in fact, all doctors. They're all medical interns at a hospital, and that we're really bad at guessing this, and there's really no reason to guess it because, for instance, while it turns out that there are more women in the nursing profession, the women in nursing profession are not naturally nurses. It turns out that when you go to college, when you go to school, when you're considering what profession to go into, women are shifted, pushed towards nursing in a way that men would be pushed towards other professions because those professions are labeled or considered associated with the gender. And the nature of this is a little complicated because it isn't one thing alone. Right? We could talk about, for instance, there's a gender bias in society which argues for educational opportunities are more available to men, but people will talk about different learning styles and multitasking versus memory versus whatever. Then the reality is that all of those things, if there is any difference, there's far more variability within one gender than there is between genders. These are the product of socialization and social production and social construction of our meanings associated with the categories. That's all. But things are gendered, and it has a real effect. Now, the weird thing about talking about stuff being gendered like that is we might think that it actually is pretty static over time. And in some cases that is, right? We've been, broadly speaking, for almost 300 years, there's been a strong bias, a strong pressure for jobs that involve caretaking of other people to be gendered feminine, because that is the kind of work, the kind of labeled work or marked work that is feminine or for women. And what we end up seeing is that it actually takes very little to modify these pathways, right? In the 1990s, there was a weird thing that happened, and people studied it a lot. In one case, it was called the ER effect, based on a hospital show called ER. Another time, they talked about the effect of the X-Files effect. And there was the CSI effect. So, for instance, um, I put a second slide here because I found a nice slide for talking about the CSI effect. But one of the ways that this works is over time, women have made up a much larger percent of doctors and lawyers since the 1980s. And part of the reason for that is whenever we have positive, realistic representations of somebody in one of these traditional male roles, or masculine coded roles on TV, you get a rise in recognition that this is an option for women. And so two of the famous ones for this were lots of people watched medical shows throughout the 60s and 70s, increasingly popular as a context for a TV show to take place. And they almost never showed women doctors. And when they did show women doctors, it tended to be in either a negative light or as a secondary character who was subordinate to the main character. When ER came on and they chose, in part intentionally, to go against those patterns, to have the head of surgery be a woman, she was in fact a woman with a disability, and to have women in both medical, professional, and management roles in their cast. People saw that on TV and they literally changed over the next 5 years the number of women who applied to medical school, the number of women who went into medical specializations like surgery. Despite there being active resistance to those changes, so many more people applied. And similarly, in the 5 years that Scully, who was a scientist and a trained doctor on X-Files, during the period that that show was highly popular, we saw a basically annual increase in the number of women who sought science majors in college. And when people studied it, it turned out that literally seeing this intelligent and capable person doing this, who was shown to be fully feminine, not in a deviant way, it wasn't marked down or she wasn't punished for it, it allowed or encouraged people to consider the possibility. Now, more recently, the CSI shows launch, I want to say the first one launched in the late 90s, but they launched quite a while ago. And what we see is that almost immediately the inclusion, and this is the opposite, unlike ER, which had intentionally wanted to break stereotypes and expectations by having women in charge, CSI very openly said they wanted attractive women in there to have sexual tension. And these incredibly sexist logics of why they wanted it turned out to include, as a side effect, that for the first time, women were able to see becoming forensic scientists as a profession. And up to the introduction of the CSI TV show series, and there are a number of these series, is almost everybody who went into forensic science either started in college in a different area of science. You went as a biology major and then moved into it, or you started off in criminal justice programs and then had an interest in science. And what ends up happening is that we go from having less than, I want to say it's less than 10% of forensic science degrees and jobs are held by women, to having today far more of the forensic science jobs are held by women than by men. But because the profession still favors men, we see that there is a dramatic salary difference for the same jobs at the same ranks and with the same training and ability for women. And so one of the things that we want to recognize is while the representation and acceptance, or at least the perception of acceptance that women can do a job, can change, other institutional factors and structures such as salary scales are not dependent on women's perception themselves. They're often produced by men's perception or structural and other issues. And so while women's ability to apply into a job increases directly based on representation, the marginalization within that job may be fairly staggering. So as I said before, one of the classic or most famous patterns of the gendering of things is the this sort of complex or very simple, depending on how you think about it, association of women as child caregivers producing the idea of other kinds of care work, whether it's nursing, education, etc., as extensions of a natural aptitude. And while there's a ton of really clear scientific evidence that says that there is no fundamental aptitude difference, right? What we're able to see, though, is that because of how you socialize and direct behaviors, how we produce adult women and men are different. It means that, for example, attention to minor emotional cues, changes in mood, you literally have to be taught to learn that. And how you read those things, and whether, for example, you respond by becoming angry when somebody else is angry, or whether you respond by asking them what's wrong when they're angry. Those are learned interactions that over the course of one's life, one is learning in a gendered way. And for instance, we have a whole theory that talks about affective labor. That is, work that involves the performance or the demonstration of certain kinds of emotion. Servers at a restaurant having to smile at the people who come in to buy food. The folks at the folks at an airport who have to maintain strict calm no matter how crazy the crowd is. And so that work of having to demonstrate certain kinds of emotions and to respond to other people's emotions in certain ways, turns out that we don't educate guys to do that. We don't do within masculine education. We don't do that as much. And so the expectation that that work is done by women means that we end up with women being stuck in certain jobs and not others in greater percentages. And by extension, because we see those kinds of work as for different people, we tend to see that the things that are masculine coded or men's jobs, men's work coded, get paid more, whereas women's work or work that is coded as affective or care work rather than other things, those are often paid less. And so one of the classic examples of the implicit hierarchy of these things is that while secretaries were traditionally gendered, executive assistants and other sort of administrative tasks where they are required to be decision makers, often we end up with those being gendered less because they are in some ways, to function properly as jobs, you are required to give them a little more respect. And so whereas somebody is allowed to yell at or talk down to a secretary, as we see those jobs being granted more responsibility and more social status, we often see decrease in the gendering of those jobs. But we'll also see that, for instance, one of these great studies that somebody did, when you change a job from secretary to executive assistant, the frequency with which you see people, women in that job wearing lipstick goes down, right? That often in order to make the transition from a highly gendered job to another one, part of what you are required to do is decrease your performance of gender. And the same thing happens with doctors, right? Nurses are often expected and treated badly if they don't wear makeup, whereas doctors are the other direction, right? In order to be a doctor, you have to downplay femininity. You are in many cases expected not to wear makeup. And if you wear too much makeup, there's active sanctioning of that. And so we see lots of these gender normative prospects play out throughout how work is done. And There are a whole lot of things about this that are not just about paid work, not just wage labor. We see how whole systems of marketing, whole systems of behavior and clothing represent these same kinds of gender. So we could talk about the clever marketing of baby clothes. We can talk about how incredibly sexist this ad on the upper right is, where the girl's clothing is awesome girl and is in pink, and the boy's clothing is awesome kid, right? And in blue, and he is a kid, like all kids, he is good. But the way that these things work is complicated, and the way that this extends to non wage labor, non-job labor also is complicated because, for instance, how much housework you're expected to do, how much other kind of work you're expected to do produces differences of real expectations. And so mentioned in the chapter is this idea that we have the double shift or the double day that is expected of women. When you get home, you still have to do all this housework, you have to do childcare, you have to take care of your husband. You may have been at work just as long as him, but the expectation is greater that you will have to put in that care work for other family members, even though in theory you are equal members of the family. And other scholars have extended that to talk about the triple day, where much of the work of producing social connections, social capital, and maintaining familial and social connections, that is, back in the day, writing all those letters to family so they don't forget you exist, or maintaining connections with family friends so that you don't cease to be friends, all the work of the social world tends to historically have been produced as feminine. And so we can see how that becomes a problem, because if you're working and doing that work and doing that triple day work and other kinds of work, there is a significant decrease in the availability of time for you to choose where you are. And so we look at a discriminatory function in how this works out based on not just the pay, but the actual availability of time for your use. That one of the things that we end up finding is that men's time and flexibility is often seen as more valuable and therefore is produced as being more flexibly or available for them. And all of this is just a mess because the reality is, again, there's no real fundamental difference that these differences have to follow. Um, there's nothing about having a penis or vagina, ovaries or testes, having a slightly higher this hormone or a slightly higher that hormone. There's nothing there that would mean that, for instance, how we express or perceive emotion would be different. And yet, in every possible measure, by the time people are adults in the United States, we have incredible differences, right? We find that women, because they are taught throughout their lives to see emotions and respond to them in certain ways, women receive more emotional and personal support from friends. We know that, for example, how men are responded to by other men tends to decrease positive response if you're highly emotional. So, for instance, if you're upset, you often are discouraged from showing your emotions, whereas women, if you're upset, are often encouraged to share more. And we get a much different process. Now, that's not a biological thing, nor is it hormonal. It is simply a process of the socialization of norms of behavior and interaction. And we see this, I hate to bring up suicide again because I told you there's this weird thing that it turns out there's a cascade effect. Even the mention of suicide can have statistical effects. But one of the things that we would notice, for instance, is while women are in some ways slightly more likely to attempt suicide, men are much more likely to die by suicide. And a whole part of that is that men, if they don't commit suicide the first time, they tend to not have therapy, support, community, and family participation in helping things get better. Whereas women, if they survive their first attempt, receive support. And I know that sounds strange, but it really makes a difference in some of these cases how we're taught to socialize. And when we talked in class, I made a comment a while ago to one of the sections that the number of close friends Americans will have as they age gets lower, in part because as our number of jobs that will work, as we move around, the number of lifelong friendships or close friendships that we develop through work goes down. And we are increasingly dependent on the friendships we make early in life, in school, in college, um, or in non-work hobby activities, but we actually work more hours and spend less time on hobbies, and those hobbies tend to be more solitary, things like playing video games, which means we're less likely to make close friendships. And as a result, we are often making more casual acquaintances, more less close friends, and we still have to put some work into maintaining those, and that draws time away. And so literally how we're taught to interact, how we're taught to spend time, how we live our lives produces different social responses. And the same thing is true with how we find dates, how we get into romantic relationships, and how families form are gendered and are the product of all of these piled up elements. So, how we're taught to act, how we're taught to think, how we are taught to be gendered, as well as all the other social institutions like race and ethnicity, um, they really do shape how we experience our lives. Now, if in the last slide I mentioned how we experience our lives, I want you to understand that the opportunities and the enactment of our genders by other people, the being forced into categories, can be pretty dramatic. There was a famous story within the last couple of years where uh, a male software engineer had been critical of a female coworker's response to having been criticized for bad work. And he said he was sure that there was something about her work. It wasn't just sexism. So they switched email addresses, and it turned out that even when he made the same kind of arguments, the same discussions that he had had accepted from him in the past, um, his making those arguments in the same way tended to escalate the arguments between him and customers so that he was often accused of being irrational in without changing anything except the email address that he was using to send and the gender code of the name associated with the email address. And it turns out that even within very narrowly constructed professional categories where expert skills are used, these expectations and social conceptions of how we expect other people to act, for instance, whether you are allowed to be confrontational or to disagree, turns out to dramatically change employment. And that's after you get the job, where it turns out that the pathways and structures to put people in jobs, the salaries offered, etc., are all dramatically different. I mentioned at one point that, for instance, within the core engineering disciplines at the college level, we can look at the ratio of where and how women are allowed into them or steered into them to such a degree that we see that there's nearly 50% of biomedical engineers are women, and that's a dramatically higher percentage than when we look at something like mechanical engineers. Now, there are tons of mechanical engineers trained every year, but within that category of mechanical engineers, a far smaller proportion are women. And there are some of the specialties that we end up seeing as very biased indeed. Now, in general, what we're looking at in the United States is secondary effects. So if you just say we're not paying women as much, that would be illegal. But it turns out that if you review their work and you give more positive reviews to the men, less positive reviews to the women, then a change over time to decrease salary happens. Similarly, if you get into your job interview and you're being asked to describe your pay scale, if it's acceptable to push to the top of the pay scale for men, whereas that same aggressive negotiation would be seen as a bad thing for women, women tend to be less able to argue for higher pay raises and for higher starting pay. And so we have a whole lot of things like that, including some that do go back to those systems of gender being related to childcare and other care work. Because if you are responsible for taking care of kids, you can't spend 100 hours a week at your associate's position as a lawyer, you have to be down at home for some of that time. So if the way that everybody who's an associate at the law firm gets evaluated is based on that 100 hours a week, and you have to keep children alive, well, all of a sudden you are not as good a worker and you're not going to advance in your career. And those different standards can be produced or responded to in policy. So, for instance, penalizing people for not working extra hours beyond a certain minimum is protected behavior in Europe. You can't decrease or slow down somebody's annual raises because they won't work 100 hours. And so that rule will actually prevent overworking of men also, but it's particularly that kind of rule which is meant to produce a more economically stable and effective system to prevent discrimination that we could look at as a model. And we can change how both employment law and worker regulation laws work in this. But in general, what we're going to see is that even though the law still says everybody is treated equally, as long as the law only has certain elements of what treatment you're looking at, we can see a lot of discrimination. There's a famous joke, not joke, that goes, when is a woman screaming and when is she talking loud? And the answer is when she's black, she's screaming. And the thing about this is that the performance of how you are exposed to, how gender rules are enforced, how gender is conceived and participated in, it never stands alone. And so last week, talking about race and ethnicity, we talked a little about intersectionality and the idea that how and in what ways each category or type of identity participates in, allows for both oppression and privilege is complicated. And when we were talking a few slides ago, when I was talking about feminism and said there was a disagreement about whether those other aspects, the intersectional aspects, need to be paid attention to, that continues to be a real negotiation. Now I'm running short on time, so I'm not gonna talk much today about it, but we should, as we go, talk about how the different intersectional groups or different intersectional identity categories shape each other if people want. All right, I'm going to leave off more or less with one last thought, and that is early in the lecture we talked about binaries being different from spectrums or gradations or ways of looking at things that recognize there's not just two categories. And one of the famous origins of the discussion of spectrums for sex, sexuality, and gender came from the work of Kinsey, who was a biologist who worked early in his career within animal studies and then moved on to looking as a psychologist and a biologist at human beings. And he looked at the expression and frequency of sexual attraction in people. And as he looked at the group of people he studied, initially a couple of thousand people, and as the Kinsey study went on for years, he looked at tens of thousands of people. And what he found was very, very few people were 110% straight or 110% gay. And he said it is actually probably a much better way to think about it, that there is a graduated scale where on one end you have that magical 100% straight person who'd never looked at somebody of the same sex and thought of anything sexual, and somebody at the far end who's 100% gay and never thought about anybody of the opposite sex in any sexual way. But to some degree, everybody has some little bit within that spectrum that moves across. And the idea of the Kinsey scale was that different people fall on that scale at different places. You have bisexuals who are very near the middle. You have, extremely homosexual or extremely heterosexual persons. And he says what ends up being at debate is where we draw the line, right? That the reason there's a slanted line there is that you can be a little bit, like you don't have to act on it. You can just be a little bit interested. You can be like, that guy's a hot guy or that girl's a hot girl and not do anything. And you can still be straight enough to be in that category. And he says what we end up with is a gradation or a spectrum on which there is a labeling function that is not graduated, is not diverse. And later on, many people respond to this. Many scholars work within this same framework. And so, for example, the scholar Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who talked about this and said what we're really looking for is not homosexuality, but we're looking at ways that people are interacting with and participating with people of the same sex and different sexes. And that in North America, one of the things that's even weirder is perhaps because people are afraid of being marked as homosexual or because there's specific structural gender norms and biases, it turns out that there's increasingly categories of people who literally just don't spend time with people of the opposite sex unless it is marked as sexual. And so Kosofsky-Sedgwick begins to be interested in or curious about how we produce that homosocial, that is, you can only be with people like you process. And she actually argued that there was, to some degree, an eliding or a mixing up that happens where because there are these social structures and institutions and norms that define appropriate behavior based in this very sharp contrast between homosexual and that is often deviant and penalized, and heterosexual, which is normative and rewarded, the behaviors that would potentially get those punishments tend to be complicated. And that means that we see a lot of men where the structural penalties or deviancy or the heteronormativity demands careful policing of the possibility of being seen as homosexual produces a strongly homosocial bind, whereas women are more likely to be allowed to be around other people, especially in groups in certain ways. And so we can look at how sexuality and general behavior and gender norms all mix up and produce these different categories. Okay, guys, thanks. That's all for today. I mean, I could have gone on, but I know that I've run a little long on time already, so we are skipping this week. I'm not here to give you this lecture in person, and hopefully you're listening to all this, doing your reading, taking your quiz, and we will pick up with our discussion next time. If you're having a class this week, we'll continue this discussion in person. Otherwise, we'll try and sneak in any questions you have or any topics related to this into the discussion next week. I will talk to you soon. Let me know if you have any questions in Discord or if you want to make an office hour appointment or something. Remember, the regular office hours are canceled Monday through Wednesday. There's no open drop-in hours. I will have some expanded drop-in hours next Friday.